Thai Blacknick formula and relied on these payments to compensate lost property tax revenue. I would, if there's no objection, I would like to enter both these letters into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Surprisingly, no one wants to talk about these payments because they would be considered earmarks. Earmarks which the sponsor voted against supporting along with many other members of his caucus. I represent a district with a lot of federal lands. My counties get payments through PILT, through secure rural schools. We have to fight like crazy to extend payments every time these bills come for reauthorization. Yet today, we have a bill that purports to be about education funding for Minnesota kids. What kind of role models are we if we can't even have an educated conversation about what federal money is currently going to Minnesota? Let's just look at the arithmetic. Minnesota State Representative Denise Derrick testified before the committee that the state was losing $650,000 annually from foregone revenues because the state trust lands were within the wilderness area. She supports the enactment of this legislation to make up for this revenue. Yet because of the Hastings Amendment, this legislation actually takes $1 million in revenue away from the counties of Lake, Cook, and St. Louis. Are we robbing Peter to pay Paul? That's the question, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman's request to include the letters in the record will be handled under general leave. Gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I advise my friend that I'm prepared to close. If the gentleman will yield back his time, I'll be prepared to close.
Gentleman from Arizona.
Continue to reserve the balance of my time. We have no other people to talk.
Mr. Chairman, I'm prepared to close if the gentleman is prepared to yield back.
Gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Among the many flaws in the legislation is a provision waiving compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, NEPA. NEPA has been under attack by the Republicans for years. Most famously, former Chairman Pombo led a year-long effort to undermine the law before leaving Congress. NEPA stands for two very simple principles. The first is the federal government should think before it acts, and the second is that the federal government should listen to the American people before it acts. NEPA does not dictate outcome. It requires federal agencies to gather information, consider alternatives, seek public input before taking action that would significantly impact the environment. Waiving NEPA means waiving educated decision-making. Waiving NEPA means waiving transparency, and waiving NEPA means waiving the possibility that the American people should play a role in managing the natural resources which they own. In the case of H.R. 5544, waiving NEPA means waiving any process for determining which federal lands will be given to the state, what lands will be traded away, and how will they be chosen. Apparently, that information is to remain secret. Will lands currently used for recreation or to protect water quality or to preserve critical habitat be traded to the state for logging and mining? We have no way to know. Waiving NEPA shrouds this land deal in secrecy and insulates it from any public input. Why should any member of this House oppose allowing his or her constituents to have input in the management of federal natural resources? Cutting out public input is undemocratic, unwise, and unfair. Now we have heard claims that NEPA should be waived because it leads to so-called frivolous litigation. Of course, frivolous is often in the eye of the beholder. The fact that NEPA is more than 40 years old, its regulations are flexible and well settled, and NEPA litigation is fairly rare. What's more, timber companies, cattlemen, mining companies, and other industry plaintiffs file NEPA litigation just as often, if not more, than environmental groups. We are also told that NEPA causes too much delay. This accusation is also unfounded. NEPA regulations allow for agreed-upon timeframes and page limits to move the process along. Instances where NEPA process appears to drag on are often the result of an applicant who fails to provide necessary information in a timely fashion or changes the parameters of their project midstream. These anti-NEPA claims are not based in fact, and they're a smokescreen. A smokescreen designed to hide the fact that the real goals of exempting this land deal from NEPA is to shield this exchange from public scrutiny. Later today, Mr. Holt will have an amendment to restore NEPA compliance for this land deal, and that amendment should be approved. A vote for NEPA is a vote for the idea that the average American might have something valuable to say about the management of his natural resources. A vote for the bill without NEPA is a vote to shroud this deal in darkness so that its potential impacts on habitat or water quality or recreation remain hidden from public view. Mr. Chairman, I reserve my time.
Gentleman reserve his time, or the gentleman yield back? Did the gentleman reserve his time, or?
Reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Washington.
Well, I just advised my friend I'm prepared to close if he'll yield back.
Huh?
Gentleman from Arizona.
This is I will close this point. I have this debate, quite honestly, Mr. Chairman, makes me feel like I'm living in an alternative reality. A reality where the protections of God's bounty on this earth is nothing more than an opportunity cost for local governments. A reality where we think it's perfectly acceptable to fund our children's education by stealing from the natural resource legacy our forefathers sought to protect. A reality where $650,000 for St. Paul is more important than $1 million going to counties most impacted by this exchange. A reality where the basic ability for people to be informed about government actions and to voice their views is blocked by a party that prides itself on the idea of liberty. I don't know about you, but this is not the reality that I want to live in. We should have brought this bill to the floor. We could have brought this bill to the floor today with strong bipartisan support and resolved the real issue of isolated state lands within the boundary waters, just like the Minnesota legislature did. Instead, it is Groundhog Day, where anti-wilderness and anti-government philosophies are masked as a concern for education funding when the arithmetic doesn't actually support the argument. This is a disappointment. This bill is bad for forests, bad for wildlife, bad for the American people, and should be rejected. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself the balance of the time.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I am sitting here absolutely amazed by the debate on this issue. This is really very, very simple. In 1978, there was no boundary canoe, water canoe area wilderness. So there's trust lands in that part of Minnesota that was generating revenue for public schools in Minnesota. So in 1978, Congress passed the Boundary Water Canoe Area Wilderness. And they took that land out of trust. So that means there is a deficiency in trust lands for Minnesota schools. This legislation simply seeks to correct that. Nothing more than that. Nothing more than that. So, in fact, here's another way to put it, Mr. Chairman. If the Boundary Water Canoe Area Wilderness had not been passed, we wouldn't be here today, because you would have this trust land generating revenue. But because it included that area, we are here today. Now, I heard my good friend from St. Paul talking about the transparency and everybody should be involved in decision-making. What happened in 1978 when this 86,000 acres were taken out of trust? Where was the transparency? Where was the goodwill that was coming from the federal government to the citizens of Minnesota at that time? It apparently wasn't there. Now, I know the Forest Service has an opportunity, you know, they can make those adjustments. They don't need an act of Congress to do it. But, Mr. Chairman, it's been 34 years. Don't you think after 34 years, if the ability was there, that it would be done if there was a will on both sides to do so? Apparently there might have been a will on both sides, but there are others that were involved and said, no, let's slow the process down. So the Minnesota legislature said, let's get this thing going. And they passed legislation, and this simply carries out the act of the legislature that was signed by the governor. And it's really nothing more than that. I'm absolutely amazed by how the detail that goes on, because what comes out of all of this debate, from my point of view, which ironically comes from members that represent Minnesota, is they don't trust Minnesotans to make the right decisions as to what part of that national forest would be used for trust lands. I find that mind-boggling. I think the gentleman from northern Minnesota is doing right by his constituents with this legislation to correct what had happened 34 years ago. So this is a good piece of legislation, Mr. Chairman. I urge its adoption, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. In lieu of the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Natural Resources printed in the bill, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 112-30 modified by the amendment printed in Part A of House Report 112-660 is adopted. The bill as amended shall be considered as the original bill for the purpose of further amendment under the 5-minute rule and is considered read. No further amendment to the bill as amended shall be in order except those printed in Part B of House Report 112-660. Such further amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report by a member designated in the report, shall be considered read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by a proponent and opponent, shall not be subject to an amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for a division of the question. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 1 printed in Part B of House Report 112-660. For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in Part B of House Report number 112-660, offered by Ms. McCollum of Minnesota.
Pursuant to House Resolution 773, the gentlewoman from Minnesota, Ms. McCollum, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Minnesota.
Chairman, as you've already heard here today, H.R. 5545 is missing an awful lot of important details and taxpayer protections. One major omission in this bill is its failure to acknowledge the treaty rights of Minnesota's tribal nations. Treaty rights are a predominant concern in this land exchange because unspecified lands are under consideration in H.R. 5544 because we don't have a map. They're all within the Superior National Forest, which is governed by the 1854 treaty between the Chippewa Nations and the United States government. The terms of the treaty guarantee that tribal nations can continue to fish, hunt, and gather, and otherwise use the land to support their way of life. However, in its current form, this bill completely ignores the treaty rights of tribal nations. The Minnesota process that's moving forward in the state of Minnesota includes the tribal nations. We need to make sure that the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior Chippewa, the Fort Du Bois Band of Chippewa, the Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior Chippewa have their treaty obligations protected and met by the United States government. The Tribal Council of Grand Portage of Chippewa has contacted my office to express their great opposition to this bill. Karen Woman Diver, the Fond du Lac Band of Chippewa, has sent letters in opposition to Governor Dayton, Secretary Vilsack of Agriculture, Senator Frankens, Klobuchar, and to Representative Kerbach. And, Mr. Chair, at the appropriate time, I have a copy of that letter to submit to the record.
Covered by general leave.
Thank you. Minnesota tribes foresee a negative impact of this bill on their guaranteed treaty rights for use of their land because they are not being considered as part of the process under the Kerbach bill. The quote from Chairwoman Driver's letter, in fact, is, quote, "We oppose the Minnesota Education Investment Employment Act until suitable tribal consultation has occurred." The Chairwoman also disagrees with the conclusion that the exchange of more than 86,000 acres without government-to-government consultation, quote, "shall not be considered to be major federal action." It's hard to see how anyone could consider the exchange of land that is being governed by a federal treaty with sovereign tribal nations as to be anything less than a major federal action. Yet this bill denies the level of consideration for the exchange. The amendment that I'm introducing would recognize the reserved fishing, hunting, and gathering rights of the tribes and other lands under consideration. The language for this amendment was drafted in consultation with legal representation from the 3 impacted tribes tribes and from input from the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. This amendment will not solve the fundamental problems of this bill, but it is an effort to respond to the threat against tribal interests and tribal sovereignty that this bill contains. This bill does not change the fact that Minnesota now sees the federal government in a jumpstart effort to establish a process for Minnesota on how to handle the finishing touches to the land transfer. Well, I believe at least the tribal voices should be at the table to be heard. So, Mr. Chair, I do not believe that H.R. 5544 should be moved forward. I will be voting against the bill. I want to be clear about that. However, this unnecessary, unclear bill is to proceed. At least at a minimum, we should protect our U.S. government-to-government treaty rights in any land exchange. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Who claims time in opposition? The gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to the amendment. I'll yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I respect the gentlelady's concern for Native Americans. As a matter of fact, I will simply say that's one of the reasons when I became chairman of the Natural Resources Committee that we had a subcommittee dealing with their issues, because I think they were being neglected in the past. And so I share that concern. But this amendment, honestly, is really not necessary. And I have to say this, Mr. Chairman, at this very last minute here as we're debating this on the floor, it raises an issue that has not previously been risen. Let me just go back the history of this legislation. This issue was not raised at any point during the subcommittee hearing or the full committee markup of this legislation. Nor was this issue mentioned in the dissenting views that was filed by the minority in their bill report. Nor was this issue raised by the gentlelady from Minnesota's detailed letter opposing this bill that was dated on July 24th. So I don't know why it's coming up now and when it was not previously raised in the legislative process. But, Mr. Chairman, I can state very clearly that the federal government has a duty to uphold treaty obligations and trust responsibilities to Indian tribes. These will be upheld, and they are not changed by this bill. There are inherent obligations that the federal government has to Indian tribes, and they need to be respected. This amendment is not necessary, and as written, may potentially raise complex questions about whether the amendment itself would alter the treaty obligations of the Chippewa. The original treaty with the Chippewa of 1854 referred specifically to fishing and hunting rights. This amendment would add the phrase gathering to those rights without any definition of scope of what that means. Lastly, I will credit the members, the gentlelady who's sponsoring this legislation. She said last night in the Rules Committee and here just a moment ago that notwithstanding whether this amendment would pass or not, she would be opposing the bill. I take her at her word on that. But this is a last-minute issue that had not been raised. It's not necessary to respect and uphold, for us to respect and uphold the tribes, rights of tribes. And I think it's being offered, as was stated, by somebody that is just simply opposed to the bill. So for these reasons, I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment. And I understand the gentlelady has yielded back. I will yield back my time and urge a no vote on the amendment.
Question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Minnesota. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I would like a recorded vote on this amendment, please.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Minnesota will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 2, printed in Part B of House Report 112-660. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
2, printed in Part B of House Report Number 112-660, offered by Mr. Holt of New Jersey.
Pursuant to House Resolution 773, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Holt, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we have before us a bill that tells the American taxpayers to take a hike, not take a walk in the woods, but give up your place in any decision-making. Get lost. A hike from democracy and engagement in our government. Because H.R. 5544 has a provision that would bar all Americans, including Native Americans, from being provided the information about the land exchange to take place, and would bar them from participating in the democratic process to voice their views about the disposition of their property. My amendment would restore public participation in the development of this proposed land exchange by striking language that would subvert proper environmental review under the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. H.R. 5544 continues what we have seen elsewhere on this floor and in the Resources Committee that can only be called an attack on NEPA. I wonder what my colleagues have in mind, why they have such a strong knee-jerk reaction to this bipartisan initiative that was signed into law by President Nixon, you may recall. Whatever any of my colleagues may think about the advisability of the bill, the underlying bill, and the exchange that is proposed here, whatever that exchange may be, I would think my colleagues would at least want this to be done with transparency, full knowledge, and public participation. Public participation should always be of the utmost concern when planning public land projects, but it's particularly critical for the exchange that is proposed here. We aren't talking about a small land exchange. We're talking about tens of thousands of federal acres that will be going out of federal ownership and into state ownership for the purposes of mining and logging. The bill doesn't tell us which parcels will be exchanged. We have no map. We really have no idea. We do know that there are 700 miles of snowmobile trails within Superior National Forest, that there are thousands of lakes, 77 points of lake access, 13 fishing piers. We know that hunting is allowed on all these lands, including lands within the boundary waters. We also know that 25 groups, no fewer than 25 groups, have written in opposition to this exchange, expressing concerns about their ability to participate in what should be a public process. We also know that 2 million hunters and anglers represented by the Minnesota Backcountry Hunters and Anglers Association oppose this bill because, in their words, hunters have a vested interest because we now have access to these properties, something that's never guaranteed when management begins switching hands, end quote. Finally, we know why the state of Minnesota wants these federal lands. They want the lands to generate receipts for their school trust through mining and logging. So we know some things, but there's much we don't know. There's much that should be brought out to the public. This entire exchange is justified on the state's belief that it is losing $650,000 a year because it can't mine and log lands within the Boundary Waters Canoe Wilderness Area. The public deserves to know more about this exchange and to have a voice in the future of these lands. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, which would ensure that the public can play a role in this exchange if the exchange is to go forward. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I yield myself 2 minutes.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment would undermine the purpose of the bill by allowing a cabinet secretary or even a low-level federal bureaucrat the authority to override an act of Congress and delay this land exchange. Let's be specific. This bill directs a land exchange of lands for state lands for federal forest lands. The simple result of the exchange will be that the boundaries would be state rather than federal. Management of lands exchanged to Minnesota will continue to be responsible under United States law. Now, Mr. Chairman, under the U.S. Constitution, it is the legislative branch of government that writes our nation's laws. It's the responsibility of the executive branch to execute the laws written by Congress. This amendment would result in giving the executive branch the ability to undermine, ignore, or ignore written law. This land exchange would be subjected to years of costly red tape and bureaucratic foot-dragging. As a matter of fact, Mr. Chairman, that's been going on for 34 years. That's why we're here today. The priority of the gentleman from Minnesota's bill is the school children of Minnesota. But it seems the priority of the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey is more federal red tape to protect federal bureaucracy and more lawsuits. So I urge defeat of this amendment, and I yield back the balance of the time I yielded myself. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from New Jersey.
The chairman must think that it is so inconvenient to deal with a pesky public. You know, whether this is congressionally mandated or comes about in any way, something of this scale involving the public's land should involve the public in a very open way in understanding what it will be and in carrying it out. That's all this says. That's all this amendment would do, would allow the NEPA process, the environmental process that applies to so many things around this country, to apply to this important transaction. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Washington.
Chairman, I'm very pleased to yield 3 minutes again to the sponsor of this legislation, Mr. Kravac from Minnesota.
Gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentleman again for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition of this amendment. The Secretary already has the authority that the amendment is supposed to possess. That's what got us here in the first place. This amendment would undermine the purposes of the bill by giving the Secretary the option to continue the delaying and obstructing a land exchange with the state of Minnesota. This is an issue that Minnesota and the federal government have been working on for over 3 decades under existing authorities. This amendment would only continue the status quo, so I must oppose it. Stalling the process further helps no one, least of which the school children and teachers of Minnesota. Mr. Speaker, we've had public input for over 30 years, and that has culminated in the bipartisan State Senate File 1750 that was passed earlier this year by an overwhelming bipartisan vote in the state legislature and signed by Democrat Governor Mark Dayton. The public has spoken. The bill has support of the people of the 8th District of Minnesota and would execute a bipartisan plan passed by the Minnesota legislature signed by the governor. The only groups that oppose this bill are fringe groups, many of those being from out of state. This amendment would give the environmentalists free rein to sue the federal government and have attorney fees paid for by the taxpayers of the United States. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. In addition, we've heard a couple times today, where's the map? Well, here it is. Here's the map. H.R. 5544 no longer contains a direct reference to the Forest Service maps because H.R. 5544 is executing a state bill. State File 1750, which does specify lands to be exchanged in Section 4 of the bill. Subsection 3, priority. In exchange of the state land under this section shall give priority to the exchanges that provide the most opportunity for revenue generation for the permanent school fund, and priority shall be given to lands within the Superior National Forest and the Mesabi Purchase Unit in the St. Louis County in the following townships of St. Louis County: Township 59 North, Range 14 West; Township 59 North, Range 13 West; Township 60 North, Range 13 West; and Township 60 North, Range 12 West. The Minnesota DNR has maps of these lands. The Forest Service has maps of these lands. Actually, they're available online. The last year, the Forest Service prepared maps for an earlier draft of H.R. 5544, but when the state passed the Senate File 1750, we changed the references in the bill from the Forest Service maps to the state's passed plan. The reason why H.R. 5544 doesn't specify lands is because it executes the state plan, which does specify the lands. Again, the maps are available from either the Forest Service or the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now I yield to the Chair.
Gentleman.
I yield.
Sir, you said that there is designated land on the other half of the exchange. I'm very well of the school trust lands. Can you show me a map? I know that the state talks about areas.
Gentleman's
Can you
time
show
has
me
expired.
a map?
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Washington has 30 seconds remaining.
I yield myself the 30 seconds.
Gentleman's recognized for 30 seconds.
Mr. Chairman, I hear the crocodile tears for no NEPA in this process. I just remind my colleagues that when this area was designated wilderness, NEPA was not involved. Now, once this land is, the land trade is made, it is subject to Minnesota Environmental Policy Act. So there is a process on which this will be carried out. So I think this, I don't support the amendment. I urge a no vote on the amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no.
No.
Opinion of the Chair, the noes have it.
The other one.
Gentleman from New Jersey.
I request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 3, printed in Part B of House Report 112-660. For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota seek recognition? Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 3, printed in Part B of House Report number 112-660, offered by Mr. Ellison of Minnesota.
Pursuant to House Resolution 773, the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Ellison, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm rise to present an amendment that would require that if, as these exchanges go forward, that they would have to be done in a manner that does not hurt private property interests. There's no doubt that when the exchanges are effected, the people in the forest areas who will acquire them will be looking to mine them and log them and things like that. But the fact remains that there are other legitimate private property interests there, and these private property interests should be protected. The bill introduced by my colleague from Minnesota, Representative Krivak, has no protections for areas for high ecological and recreational value, risk the livelihood of small businesses that rely on the recreational tourists to survive and thrive, and risk the values of private property within the Superior National Forest. In a region that depends upon $1.6 billion of revenue from outdoor recreation, we cannot risk our natural lands for the short-term gain of the mining industry. My amendment would simply ensure that no land would be exchanged if it would likely have a negative impact on private or small business interests. In this House, we often hear it said we should not pick winners and losers. I agree with that. We shouldn't. And therefore, this amendment, if adopted, would protect and ensure that no land would be exchanged if it would likely have a negative impact on the private property interests. Mr. Speaker, I'd like you to know that the white areas here are private property. As you can see, they're interspersed in the green. As land is transferred down and exchanged, there's a lot of private land next to the forest land, and the private property interests are at risk, and the amendment, if passed, would protect them. Many studies have found that private property and housing values decrease the closer they are to mines. Just take it from the standpoint of a small business. Many small businesses depend upon protecting the natural resources in the area. Sulfide mining, being considered in this region, can leach sulfuric acid into lakes and rivers, killing aquatic life and ruining someone's small business or fishing resort. Sulfide mining is generating significant public concern and deserves an open, transparent process of evaluation. Mining has a role in the economy in its right place and with the right protections. But no one denies that it can harm the environment and small businesses if it is done in the wrong place, in the wrong manner. Mr. Speaker, let me just talk about Jane Kosak. Jane is the owner of the River Point Resort and Outfitting Company located in the Superior National Forest. And she's very concerned about the impact of this bill on her small business. She says the bill will be absolutely devastating to the tourism economy. She says her own town exists on tourism, which is dependent upon clean water and clean air. She also says private property values in the area are already going down from existing drilling. Mining hurts small businesses like Jane's that cater to the anglers, the paddlers, the hikers, the vacationers in the region. We need greater transparency. Minnesota landowners and small businesses deserve an open, transparent process, but that's not what we're getting. The state of Minnesota has already created an open process to transfer state lands within the boundary waters. No federal legislation is required for this land exchange to take place. We should not be waiving environmental and public comment. At the very least, if we go forward with this misguided bill, we should ensure that private property and small business is protected. I ask you to support the Ellison Amendment and oppose the bill from my colleague in Minnesota. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I yield myself a minute and a half.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment is unnecessary, and it would allow the federal bureaucracy an automatic excuse to stop implementation of this bill when it becomes law. It would provide the Forest Service with vague authority to simply delay or outright block an act of Congress. Does that sound familiar? While presented as property rights protection, the plain fact is that this bill only involves exchange of lands between state lands and state forest lands. So I want to be very, very clear. Not 1 square inch of private property is included in this exchange. Again, this is only state and federal lands. And I have to say, Mr. Chairman, on my committee, a lot of our discussion on a variety of issues talks about private property rights. And when we have debate on that and we have votes on amendments on those issues, I find it rather ironic that the party of the gentleman that's offering this amendment always tend to vote against those amendments that protect private property rights. Once again, this amendment, the net result would be to give the federal bureaucracy ability to slow down carrying out this act. And with that, I reserve my balance.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Minnesota. Gentleman has 1¼ minutes remaining.
I'll reserve.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Washington.
I would ask my friend from Minnesota in the well. I only have one other speaker, and we have the right to close. So if the gentleman wants to use his time, we'll.
Gentleman from Minnesota.
Certainly.
Gentleman recognized.
You know, I appreciate the gentleman's reflection that that the exchange is between state land and state land, but it's next to private property land. That's exactly the point of my amendment. That if I have a business, or better yet, not me, but Jane, who does in fact have a business, that is next to a mine that is leaching hazardous material, it will negatively impact her business. This is not a dispute between public and private. It's a dispute between big private interests and smaller ones. We're here in Congress to stand up for people who need a voice. I doubt these multinational mining interests need Congress to stand up for them. But the Janes who run in resorts around in this forest do. And we're simply asking you to adopt an amendment that will stand up for the private property rights of regular citizens who had a dream and fulfilled it. Opening a resort, opening up a tackle shop, doing things that are deeply rooted in Minnesota's heritage. So I yield back.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield the balance of the time to the author of this legislation, Mr. Kravak from Minnesota.
I thank the gentleman once again for yielding. Mr. Speaker, because the way this amendment is worded, I have great concerns as to how it's going to affect mining and timber jobs in the new school district lands. I would yield to the gentleman to explain how he thinks the amendment would affect jobs in the 8th District of Minnesota concerning mining and lumber.
If I understand the gentleman's question correctly, I think that it will negatively impact jobs
Reclaiming my time then. Mr. Speaker, I'd ask my colleague if he knows how much mining taxes contribute to the state of Minnesota. Now I'll yield.
Well, the point is, of my amendment is that this bill, your bill is going to hurt small business.
Reclaiming my time.
Look, I'm not going to yield to you if you won't let me answer the question.
House is not in order, Mr. Speaker.
Time.
Mr. Speaker, as you can see from the most recent mining tax guide from the state of Minnesota, the 8th District of Minnesota contributes $79.1 million to the state of Minnesota. And that is just not inclusive of the income related to taxes from jobs from the minings that will go on in the state of Minnesota. Is the gentleman opposed to mining or in Minnesota? Can you give me an example how he's supported mining?
I'm not sure.
I'll yield.
If the gentleman's going to let me answer, I'll be happy to answer you.
I'll give you 15 seconds.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Look, the fact is what you're doing is trying to say that you're going to stand up for the big money people as opposed to the cumulative small business people. I think if you put the number of small business people together, your big multinational mining interests that are going to pollute their businesses
Reclaiming
need
my
to stand
time.
back.
Reclaiming my time. Mr. Speaker, I'd ask my colleague, I'm going to tell my colleague how much the mining and timber contribute to the school trust fund yield. Mr. Speaker, in the most recent school trust fund report shows that mining and timber contribute $23.17 million in 2011. Now, maybe doesn't sound like much here inside the Beltway, but I'll tell you what, that's a lot of money where I come from. Does the gentleman think that schools in Minneapolis are adequately funded? I'll answer that for you. Probably not. Because in North Branch, Minnesota, where I live, public schools just went to 4 days, and then we got 40 kids in a classroom. I think our teachers and kids could use the extra funding. Also, I'm very interested right now that the gentleman is very concerned about small interests in the rural communities. I find that very enlightening. I'd like to yield to the gentleman if he could tell me how a small business would be affected by the land exchange and have for job creation.
I tell you this, about less than 1% of money for schools comes from trust lands. It's a very tiny percentage. I mean, so we're going to sacrifice our heritage for a multinational mining company and
reclaiming my
the
time.
school kids,
Reclaiming
really
my time.
isn't.
Obviously, the gentleman from Minnesota does not think any money going into the school trust fund is beneficial. Decisions such as these should not be made by Washington bureaucrats in D.C. They should be made by Minnesotans. And that is how we got into this mess in the first place. The bill merely executes a bipartisan state plan signed by the governor, Senate File 1750. We cannot trust Washington political appointees with the power to derail land exchange at the expense of Minnesota school children and their teachers. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Washington. Question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Minnesota. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. And Chair, the noes have it.
A recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Minnesota will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 4, printed in Part B of House Report 112-660. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 4, printed in House Report number 112-660, offered by Mr. GRIJALVA of Arizona.
Pursuant to House Resolution 773, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. GRIJALVA, and a member opposed, need for control 5 minutes. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you. The amendment I am offering does one simple thing, and one thing only. It ensures that this land trade is fair and protects the American taxpayers. For every land exchange undertaken by the Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, Park Service, or Fish and Wildlife Service, land managers must ensure taxpayer assets are protected by requiring land appraisals based on accepted federal standards. This House has considered 6 different land exchange bills in this Congress. Each and every one of them required standard appraisals for those lands, and they all passed. But today we have a bill that defers to legislation passed by the state of Minnesota to control the examination and value determination of federal lands. This is not how we treat federal assets. Whether a land exchange is undertaken through an administrative process or through legislation, we require a standard appraisal and the equalization payments if the value of the lands considered for exchange are not equal. Surely we can provide better protections to the taxpayers of this country. The last estimate, and I will stress estimate, of the value of the land in question was nearly $100 million. Do we really want to abandon our responsibilities as stewards to federal taxpayers and waive fair appraisal standards? Surely we can hold Congressman Carvalho's legislation to the same bar and standard we required of Congressman Herger's, Congressman Gosar's, Congresswoman Tsonga's, Congressman McCune's, Congressman Amadei's bill, and yes, my own bill. I understand a lot of members on the other side of the aisle would happily turn over federal lands to the states. In fact, that position is reflected in their party's platform. But this isn't what we're voting on today. Today we are voting on a land deal that shouldn't turn the taxpayer interest upside down. I would urge support of my amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Washington.
I rise in opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I yield myself 2 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, the purpose of this bill is to ensure a fair exchange of lands on state and federal areas, and there are protections that were put in specifically in the bill. And of course, the big protection is that the Secretary of Agriculture, who is a federal representative in this process, has to agree. So, I mean, you've got one party, two parties that have to agree, and one of them is federal. Now, what could be more protection than that? Now, let me go back just a minute. We seem to have to talk about the history of this. The valuation of the land in 1978, when this wilderness area was developed, I wasn't here, nobody here on the floor that's debating this were here at that time. But I doubt if there was a valuation that was given to Minnesota at that time. And now they want to come back and say, okay, we have to have a precise valuation on the federal level. Come on. This corrects something that was not done in 1978. This amendment simply slows down the process, which I might add, Mr. Chairman, that seems to be what the process is with all four amendments that were taken up today. Slow down the process. 34 years, isn't that long enough? This is not a good amendment. I urge your rejection of it, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Arizona.
Yeah. I yield the remaining time to a gentlelady from Minnesota, Ms. McCollum.
Gentlelady from Minnesota is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank Mr. GRIJALVA. This is not about slowing down the process. And I know it's not the intention of the members on the other side to assume my motivations. I know it's not their intention. This and the amendments that I offered are because there is a process in place in Minnesota that allows for people to be at the table, for tribes to be at the table, to follow the regular order, to have a regular appraisal like everyone else has had, and to have a map on the floor and not start creating a wave of federal legislation that, to my knowledge, no one has asked for this legislation to have a vote on the floor today. There is no Senate companion. There is no urgency. There is no emergency. The state of Minnesota has a process in place. And I will say, as a state legislator, there were times, yes, I didn't think we needed to move forward with the land exchange. But the northern legislators have convinced overwhelmingly with the governor of Minnesota that this land exchange needs to take place, and it should take place. And I'm not trying to slow it down. I am trying to take this bad legislation and put it aside and let the good legislation and let the regular order that the state of Minnesota has established in order to have these lands exchanged move forward. That is my motivation. Good legislation, not for the first time in the history on the floor of this House, passing a land exchange without a map, and for the first time that I've heard, not use the regular federal standard appraisal process. It sets a bad precedent. And I don't think anybody is out to do wrong by the school children in Minnesota. My children attended K through higher ed in Minnesota. And I know how strapped we are for cash. And I do believe that, that there will be very slight amounts of dollars that will go back into school trust. But you know, that's going to happen whether or not we take this bad vote on this bad bill today or not. The school children in Minnesota will be served. This land will be exchanged. The question for this Congress is, do we do it the right way? Do we do it the wrong way? Do we set a bad precedent for future land exchange bills? Or do we make sure that we allow a fair, open, transparent process that started in Minnesota, finishes in Minnesota? With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. Gentleman from Washington.
I'm sorry.
Mr. Chairman, I will yield the balance of my time. Do I understand the time on the other side has expired?
Gentlelady has yielded back the balance of her time.
Does the gentleman from Arizona still have time?
No. The gentleman from Arizona yielded the remaining time to the gentlewoman from Minnesota, and she yielded back the balance of her time.
And so all the time
has expired.
That's what I was trying to get to. I know this is complicated. I am very pleased to yield the balance of the time again to the author of this legislation, Mr. Kovac from Minnesota.
The gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for 3.5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman again for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the amendment. This amendment is unnecessary and only further serve to delay the implementation of the overall bill. The valuation of the lands to be exchanged is required by Minnesota State Senate File 1750, requires that the lands not only be substantially equal in value, but the valuation is done in a manner agreed to between the state commissioner and the authorized representative of the United States. In addition, subsection D of H.R. 5544 on page 4 requires the survey to be satisfactory to the Secretary of Agriculture. We have had 30 years of delay. 30 years of appraisals, 30 years of map making. We don't need any more. The children of Minnesota, these are their lands, and they're entitled to them. Mr. Speaker, the state knows the land, what it's worth, just as well as the federal government. We can do it for a lower cost, and since much of the work has already been done. The lands have been identified. Here's the map. This section right here, and this section right through there. This amendment is a stall tactic, quite frankly, to increase the administrative burden and increase in costs of the state. Subsection D also requires for the state to cover all costs. It is grossly unfair to ask the state to pay for an appraisal and then be made to comply with bureaucratic federal rules in the process of the valuation. The legislation leaves the Secretary ample authority to properly protect taxpayers, does not waive any applicable appraisal standards. Both H.R. 5544 and the Minnesota Senate File 1750 require negotiations to be mutually agreed upon, and the lands conveyed to the state would be subject to all applicable state and local laws. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I will yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Washington.
Yield back the balance of my time.
Question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no.
No.
Opinion Chair, the noes have it. Gentleman from Arizona.
Ask for recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona will be postponed. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, proceedings will now resume on amendments printed in Part B of House Report 112-660, which further proceedings were postponed in the following order. Amendment number 1 by Mr. McCollum of Minnesota, Amendment number 2 by Mr. Holt of New Jersey, Amendment number 3 by Mr. Ellison of Minnesota, Amendment number 4 by Mr. GRIJALVA of Arizona. The Chair will reduce to 2 minutes the minimum time for any electronic vote after the first vote in this series. The unfinished business is a request for a recorded vote on Amendment number 1 printed in Part B of House Report 112-660 by the gentlewoman from Minnesota, Ms. McCollum, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevail by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in Part B of House Report number 112-660, offered by Ms. McCollum of Minnesota.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. Sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 15-minute vote.
The House this afternoon has been debating a bill that would exchange federal land for about 90,000 acres of state-owned land in northern Minnesota in the Boundary Waters Canoe area. Here, a consideration, debate, and now votes on 4 amendments to that legislation. We also expect a Democratic motion to recommit and final passage of the H.R. 5544. And following this series of votes, we expect the House to then turn to debating extending the electronic surveillance law called FISA for another 5 years. Chris Strom, Bloomberg, is reporting on that, joining us from Capitol Hill. With so little time before lawmakers leave town again, why is this FISA renewal getting such valuable debate time?
Well, the current law expires at the end of December, and so members of Congress want to be able to get a reauthorization through, and the House is taking it up today. Essentially, the bill would renew the government's authority to conduct electronic surveillance on foreign terrorists abroad, even if that communication involves U.S. citizens. And that's one of the main sticking points in terms of objections, how much authority the government should have to do electronic surveillance on the communications of U.S. citizens.
Is the entire law being renewed or just certain parts?
What's being renewed is a section that would explicitly authorize the government to conduct electronic surveillance without warrants. This was passed in 2008. It was passed to update the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And just a quick history, what happened is that after the 9/11 attacks, the Bush administration began a broad program of electronic surveillance, which involved the communications of U.S. citizens. And the New York Times reported on it in 2005. And at that point, the Bush administration tried to put it under the authority of and oversight of a secret court that oversees FISA. And the court ended up ruling that there was inconsistencies in the law, which forced Congress to come back and update the FISA Act itself. And that was what was updated in the 2008 law. And that's what expires at the end of this year. So members of Congress are now considering the reauthorization of it.
How does the House bill compare with that put forward by the Senate Intelligence Committee Chair Dianne Feinstein of California?
Well, there's differences over in the Senate in terms of how long they want to do the extension for. The House bill would extend the authorities until the end of 2017. The Senate has two competing bills. There's a bill from the Senate Intelligence Committee which would extend the authorities until 2017. But then there's a competing bill from the Senate Judiciary Committee which would extend it until 2015. And the Judiciary Committee also has additional provisions in there to ensure that the constitutional rights of U.S. citizens are being protected. Now, there's still divisions among senators over exactly what should be in the bill, and that's where the center of gravity is going to shift now over to the Senate. And the administration, the Obama administration, has said that this is their top legislative priority. And so following, within the next several weeks, heading into December, there's going to be backroom negotiations between the administration and senators to try and work out a deal. Right now, Senator Wyden from Oregon actually has a hold on the Senate bill.
What's behind his hold on the bill, and is there any indication he's going to let go?
He has two primary concerns, and there are indications that he will let go if he can amend the bill. The main primary concern for him is that he wants to know, along with other senators, how many Americans have had their communications monitored under this law. The administration, pretty incredibly, says that it cannot provide that figure. It cannot tell senators, even in a classified setting, how many Americans have had their communications reviewed under the law. So Senator Wyden wants to put in a provision into the bill that would require the administration to provide just a rough ballpark estimate. Is it 100? Is it 1,000, 10,000, whatever it is? And he also wants to add a provision that would prevent the administration from looking at the communications of U.S. citizens in order to target U.S. citizens without a warrant. And so he says if he can get assurances that his amendments will be considered, he'll lift his hold.
Chris Strom of Bloomberg News covering the renewal of FISA. Thanks for the update.
Thank you.
And back to the House floor live. 6 votes in relation to a bill that would exchange about 90,000 acres of state-owned land or federal land for about 90,000 acres of state-owned land in the Boundary Waters Canoe area in Minnesota. First amendment here by Betty McCollum of Minnesota. Her amendment would ensure tribal treaty rights are preserved and tribes are consulted. So we'll get 4 amendment votes and then a Democratic motion to recommit. And that's likely to be a 15-minute vote as well. The amendment votes here, this first one's 15, and the following amendment votes are 2-minute votes.
1, the nays are 213. The amendment is not agreed to. The House will be in order. Members will please take their seats.